the good old summertime, in the good old summertime.
Welcome to part 2 of my chat with biographer Richard Tomlinson on the life and career of W.G. Grace within the period known as the Golden Age of Cricket. My name is Tom Ford. If you'd like to make a small donation to the podcast, please visit buymeacoffee.com/goldenageofcricket. We pick up our chat as we discuss Grace's relationship with his daughter Bessie and his attitude to women's cricket. Still talking about his children, unlike Bertie, his daughter Bessie actually is a very fine cricketer. And when she's a leading cricketer of her age group when she's sort of 12, 13. But then when she comes of age, so to speak, WG just says, no more cricket for you, Bessie, I'm afraid. Was WG just being of his age, or was he a particularly domineering father, do you think?
Well, I think he was being of his age. I was amused to see, I think I'm right, that she did actually play one more game of cricket after that was recorded anyway, after he said that. She was also, it's hard to tell how good she was as a cricketer. He thought she was a great cricketer, and he loves it on the boat to Australia in 80, because she goes with him when she's only 12 years old, and the youngest one, Charlie's on the boat as well. And she beats the boys at everything, including a game of cricket on deck. And she's obviously a sporty girl. I have to say that I did come across her batting scores one season for the girls' school in Clifton, where she went, and she didn't score many runs, but one just has to believe that she was pretty good at cricket for a girl, which is how he would have seen things. The most awful thing in WG and Agnes's life that had ever happened to them, and I think it surpassed anything else, was Bessie dying of typhoid in early 1899, and this is just after he had moved to Sydenham in southeast London to start this new cricket club, the London County Cricket Club, for the Crystal Palace Company. And I think it colours absolutely everything that happened to him that year, which included this celebrated bust-up with Gloucestershire, the humiliation of his last Test match against Australia, his last Test match ever, where he's jeered by the crowd and he resigns the captaincy and calls time on his Test career pretty much straight after that. And when you look at it and you put it in that sort of context, I think that W.G. Grace, he was so overwhelmed by grief and also concern for Agnes, who seems to have just sunk into the deepest depression, that he sort of lost the plot. He couldn't make decisions rationally about anything else. And I think it's also incidentally why his second book of memoirs, which is published in 1899, apart from the bits about batting, bowling and fielding and captaincy, I think, which he'd already written, really, so bad and so unreliable, because this ghostwriter is coming to see him day after day in the weeks after Bessie dies, trying to get Grace to talk about his cricket career, and you just know it's the last thing on his mind. So it's the most awful thing to happen to any parent, really. And I don't think he ever recovers from it either. I think a lot of what happens in his later life is coloured by this death that just comes out of the blue, and is even worse because he's a doctor, and they think she's recovering, and then she dies. So it's just the most terrible story.
And it is, again, I'm going to give you credit here. It's one of the things which, I asked you before, can you write anything new about Grace? Well, of course you can, because your book, for example, it does touch on it doesn't just pass over her death. It puts it in context, and certainly anyone listening who's read any biographies from, say, the first half of the 20th century probably would have mentioned the death but then moved on straight away. So modern biography is so much more, it's entertaining, but they have that insight and they're not
Yeah,
afraid to discuss the psychology of what
yeah,
this would mean for someone like WG. It's
yeah.
really fascinating. Richard, we're well into the podcast, and I feel like we haven't even touched on one aspect of WG's career, which was a huge aspect. I mean, we always talk about his batting, but we haven't spoken at all about the fact that he was truly a great all-rounder. You know, his bowling
Yeah.
played such a huge part of his career, but it certainly played a huge part in the first few decades of his career. So again, just putting it in the context of the golden age,
Sure.
his bowling sort of dried up in the 1890s. And what do we put that down to? Was it again because he was of a certain age, or was it a tactical move on his part to sort of save himself for his batting?
No, I think with it, it's that he was playing against better batsmen who figured out how to deal with this stuff.
Right. Yes.
There was quite a lot of that. He was also not very fit, but he was a pretty slow bowler. I mean, I think when you look at Grace's bowling, and one does have to talk a little bit about well, the, the, the context is pre-Golden Age, because in his youth he was a pretty good medium fast bowler with a round arm action. I mean, that was how they all bowled back then. That's really the 1860s, early 1870s, but he's getting bigger and fat. Well, he's getting fatter and fatter and slower. And I think there's no definitive moment where you can say that he's a slow bowler, but he's given up bowling the quicker stuff. But he's definitely a slow bowler. By the time you get to the late 1870s, and he takes a phenomenal number of wickets. He takes in that period. It's almost like in 5 seasons he takes something like nearly 900, maybe more than 900 wickets. And so you have to then kind of say, well, what on earth is this guy doing? The first one who really gets it, I think, about Grace and his slow bowling, his slows as he called them, was a very, very good local reporter, cricket reporter in Bristol called H.E. Roslin. And a lot of the best writing about him I found was by Roslin. And this is Roslin looking at Grace when he was a slow bowler in the 1880s. And he says his run, I'm quoting, his run, more correctly, his scuffle up to the wicket was short with elbows bent. Then his right arm would be thrust out with hand, not much above the head, and the ball would roll out of his hand. And what Roslin misses from that is the fact that he often bowled round the wicket and he often wore his MCC cap. So it's a sort of exercise in distraction, first of all.
Yeah.
He's not really turning it very much. And then there's another observer from this period, and this to me is almost more interesting, or it's just as interesting, which is Spofforth, WG's great opponent. And he commented about Grace's bowling that he said he so juggles with you that you are beaten in spite of yourself. And the reason he's getting inside your head, which is exactly what Grace was trying to do, is of course firstly because he's WG Grace. And you've got to imagine the sort of classic WG Grace delivery. He's got his brother, he's playing for Gloucestershire, say, and you see it again and again. And you've got his brother, it's very, very modern this, EM, fielding a sort of a suicidal sort of silly point. You've got his great friend Frizzy Bush, the wicketkeeper, huge rugby player, behind the stumps, and they're both growling at the batsman. There's an awful lot of sledging going on. And then the other key position, which I actually saw recently, which shows you how modern Grace was. He has his great mate Frank Townsend in this weird position. Townsend's a Bristol school teacher. He has him not at a very, very almost sort of straight behind the umpire, mid on, sort of about halfway through to the boundary. Now, I actually by accident came across a clip this season of Marnus Labuschagne bowling in a Sheffield Shield game, and he's placing the field. and he does more or less what WG did. It's obviously an exercise
Wow.
in distraction. There's some
Mm.
fielder who hasn't got a clue where, and Labuschagne is very, very precise about where he wants him. But the whole point of this is that you have the batsman thinks, WG Grace, I'm going to hit him over the top. And of course, Townsend, time and again, he doesn't quite get it right that the batsman catches him. He's kidding the batsman that it's turning, it's not, and WEM is giving him all sorts of sledge and picking up catches there. And then quite often the batsman has a great big sort of yahoo and he's stumped. So he's a very, very effective bowler, brilliant bowler, but for a very short time in his career. I mean, by the time you get to the 80s, he's really become, I mean, people have got used to this stuff. I mean, the obvious thing to do is to push him for ones and twos. And I think that's what's sort of happening. So if you look at the volume of wickets, he does take, I can't remember how many thousand wickets he takes. He takes an awful lot of wickets, but there's a sort of intensity, if you like, around the late 1870s when he's bowling this stuff, and people just can't really sort of figure it out.
Yeah, and we will touch on his statistics later in the podcast. From memory, I think he takes 2,800 first-class wickets or so, which is, it's a huge
it's an
number.
enormous, it's an enormous number,
and it's it's a number of a cricketer who bowling is really the second objective, really. But as you say, for a period there, he was almost equal batsman, equal bowler. And in some, we might touch on it later again, he has some match figures which are just extraordinary. If you're enjoying this podcast, perhaps you'd like to support it by buying me, Tom Ford, a coffee. Every little donation helps with the production costs and also inspire me to keep going. You can support by donating as little as $5. Visit buymeacoffee.com/Golden Age of Cricket. So that's his bowling. So if we return to his batting, in 1895, so 30 years after he makes his first class debut, he's approaching 48 years of age. He experiences one of the finest summers of all time, really, a summer just completely out of the box. He becomes the first batsman to score 1,000 first-class runs in the month of May. And then perhaps more iconically, he brings up his 100th first-class century. And this is the first time anyone has done it. And I think at that point in time, the next person in line had only scored like 50 first-class centuries. So he's just so far ahead of the competition. Was there anything particular about 1895 that you can think of that helps explain this iconic Indian summer?
I think firstly, the weather. The weather was dry and quite hot. I think sunny anyway for the first half of the summer. So he was playing on good. The wickets have got a lot better, and he was playing on good wickets. If one's going to adjust slightly the old man image one has of him, he's actually more dynamic then. I mean, he's 46, 47. He's more dynamic than you might think. And unfortunately, I couldn't reproduce any others. And there's only one that I used in the book, therefore. There were some cartoons that a very, very good cartoonist called Harry Furness drew of WG batting and actually also bowling and fielding in one of the games that summer where he scores 100. It's the Gentlemen versus Players at Lord's in, I think, July 1895. And you can see from Furness's pictures that Grace was still capable of sprinting, or at least running fast. And the pictures of him batting are fantastic. So I think he was not fit, but he wasn't completely sort of decrepit either. So I think that would be another reason. And I think the third thing is, and this is something that he never lost, is that Grace used to go on these hot streaks where once things happened batting wise with Grace, he was just relentless in sort of,
Mm.
okay, I mean, the most intense one before 1895, I think, would be in 1876, when he does this incredible thing where he scores 344, I don't know, big century at Bristol and then 318 in Cheltenham. And he does it all in the space of about 8 days. And actually, it's prefaced by a century scores in an impossible on an impossible pitch, but against a very strong bowling attack of Northern professionals up in Yorkshire. So he does this, that once he sort of gets in, he wants to sort of really milk it for all it's worth, and he's just on a roll. And oddly enough, I think the innings that sums it up best is the innings where he scored his 100th 100, and it was actually quite cold weather. It was dry. It sort of slightly changes what I would say. It's not all warm sunshine, but he gets to his 100 rather depressingly because do you talk about Sammy Woods at all in the Golden Age?
Yes, yeah, of
Yeah, well,
course.
Sammy Woods he was sort of kind of like a proto Ian Botham, and he's bowling for Somerset. He's Australian. He plays for
Mm.
Somerset for quite a long time. And Sammy Woods knows W.G. Grace quite well, and when Grace gets to, I think it's 99, 98, 99, Woods bowls him what I says is the most depressing ball in W.G. Grace's career, which is a sort of long hop outside leg stump, because he cannot bear to be the bowler who gets W.G. Grace out on the cusp of this great event. But the more interesting thing is what happens next, which is that Grace hasn't had enough. He wants to get a double century, and then
Mm.
he wants to get a triple century. So he
Mm.
just carries on, and in the end, he's only out. He's out, I think, for 288. So he knows this isn't going to come around very often anymore, and he just milks it for as long as he can until, I think it's true, the wickets turn wet. The weather turns and the batting conditions are not quite as good, and he tails off a bit in the second half of the season.
Yeah, and just listening to you describe his hunger for batting just reminds me, or makes me think, Richard. I mean, he was a bit of a pioneer in terms of the large scores, wasn't he? I mean, we think
Yeah,
if we fast forward a few decades, you've got Bill Ponsford and Don Bradman, who are like run-getting machines. I mean,
yeah,
albeit on very comfortable doped
yeah,
wickets, but they're regularly scoring double centuries and triple, and in the case of Ponsford, quadruple centuries, well, and
yeah,
Bradman. But here we've got Grace doing it, 30, 40 years earlier, and just having this insatiable hunger and desire,
yeah.
not just to score a century, but to score a double or a triple, and just refusing to get out.
I think, or just briefly, we have to talk about the early period because
Mm,
the, I mean, you can be a bit contrarian and say, well, he'd done most of the heavy lifting for the 100 centuries actually in the first um, 10, 11 years of his career. Because although you can argue with it in terms of, well, were they all first class games? Irving Rosenwater, the statistician,
mm,
he calculated that in 1875, when W.G. Grace scored his 50th century, you had to add up all the centuries scored by the next 13 most prolific batsmen to get a grand total
right.
of 50 to match him. And not only that, he was scoring big centuries and double centuries in some of those. I mean, there are two incredible innings he plays in 1866 at the Oval. One is a double century, and the other is he gets out for about 175. I mean, these are huge scores, and he's only
Mm,
18. So it's an amazing performance. And he has another really good season in 1876. But from then on, it's sort of incremental. He's just creeping. I mean, he has good years and bad years. He has, 1 or 2 years. I haven't got the statistics in front of me where he's maybe scoring 6, 7 centuries, but there are other seasons where he's only scoring one or two. So it's a long process to get from 50 to 100, which isn't to belittle it. It's an amazing
mm,
achievement.
yeah. And what makes that early period even more fascinating is just this, from what we understand, the state of the pitches and the wickets in those days were
Yeah,
quite horrific. I mean, by the time we get into the golden age, they're beginning to improve, but they still play
yeah,
on uncovered wickets.
yeah,
By the
yeah,
30s, there's just, the pitches are like billiard tables. But
yeah.
in the 1860s and 70s, when Grace was, as you say, hitting these centuries one after the other, the pitches were just in all sorts of
They were
conditions, and some of
terrible.
them some of them were quite dangerous. I mean,
Mm.
they resulted in a few deaths, I believe. This is obviously well before helmets, but
I don't know how much, because it's obviously a long time before the golden age. But I mean, the most notorious game was the George. It's called George Summers match in, I think it's 1871. I may have
mm,
got the year wrong. I'm pretty sure it's 1871. Correct me if I'm wrong. And it's played at Lord's, and it's MCC against Nottinghamshire, who were probably they were the strongest county back then. Um, and it's terrifying. Summers is hit. It's worse than terrifying. He's hit on by a young MCC professional fast bowler and on the head, gets concussion because this wicket is just so dangerous, and dies 2 or 3 days later. But in the same match, Grace scores a century against one of the top.
mm,
So he can do it on bad wickets. I think the one thing one might qualify slightly is I have a sneaking feeling that the Oval was a pretty good batting pitch. It was, even back
right,
then as now, it was a very professionally run cricket ground, and there were two brothers who basically looked after managing it, and there were some fairly big scores. He scored a lot of runs, and there were some fairly big scores at the Oval. So he was pretty fond of the Oval. I mean, that was one of his great hunting grounds. But yeah, if he scored 100, he wanted to score 2 or 3.
indeed. Richard, let's talk about Dr. W.G. Grace.
Yeah,
We've already touched on the fact that he was a practicing GP when he wanted to be.
yeah.
What can you tell us about his profession away from cricket, and how important was it to him?
The first thing I'd say is that there's actually a surprising amount you can find out about his career as a doctor, because the Poor Law Union that he worked for, the Barton Regis Union, their records are in the archives in Bristol. So I had quite a lot of fun just sort of looking. I mean, it's not all about W.G. Grace, not principally, but you can find out quite a lot of detail about the working life of W.G. Grace as a doctor. He came from a family of doctors. This was the sort of classic way that someone from his background could become middle class, if you like. His father was the son of a servant, I think, or certainly the grandson. They came from the servant classes on both sides of his parents' family, certainly his father, and they all became doctors. His father was a doctor, his brothers were doctors, and I don't think it's unfair to say that. I mean, he was doctor because he had to be, because that was what he was going to be. It wasn't that he had any great vocation to be a doctor. But what I would also say is that doesn't also mean, which is what people said, that he was necessarily a bad doctor. It was also said, I mean, and repeated sort of decade after his death, that, oh, well, look, it took him 11, 12 years to qualify as a doctor. So that just shows he was really thick. That was the sort of assumption. Well, no, it was because you were playing cricket the whole time.
Yes. Mm,
There's also this odd thing that needs to be corrected, which is that actually his medical training at Bristol was pretty good. His some of his tutors at these prestigious London medical schools he went to were not necessarily that great. I mean, his surgery tutor at, I think it was St Bartholomew's, who later became the master of Downing College, Cambridge, he was very skeptical about the connection between germs and disease. So you can imagine what his
mm.
operating theatre was like. So he qualifies as a doctor in 1879, basically because it's impossible for him to go on being a full-time cricketer without some kind of other income. And that is, of course, when this first fund is raised for him to buy him a practice. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is he's always referred to as a poor law doctor. That was his practice area, but most of his patients in inner city Bristol were not on the parish, as they said. I mean, that was in extremis. The poor law union would, if, as it were, pay his fees, but most of his income from doctoring actually came from seeing private patients. As to whether he was a good doctor, well, I think that what comes out during this period is that he did have, it's the first time I felt that you could get a sense of someone who, away from the cricket field, and I think this possibly had a lot to do with being married and bringing up children as well. He was very on the level. He was very grounded and sort of empathetic. And there's a lovely memory. One of his sons, we didn't talk about Edgar, his second son, who's sort of rebelled against WG in the sense that his game was tennis and WG hated the sea, and that Edgar went off to be an admiral eventually in the Navy. But Edgar had a great story he told about Christmas lunch at the Graces in a Bristol, where they just used to invite all the neighbours round and for Christmas lunch, anybody who really couldn't afford to have a proper Christmas lunch. So he had that kind of quality already by then of being I think sort of compassionate and caring, which is not something you particularly associate with Grace on the cricket field. And he did it. He carried on doctoring, but he much preferred playing cricket. Obviously, that was his real vocation. He was charging all over the country. So every summer, and you can pick this up in the local newspapers, every spring, he had to hire a locum to look after the practice while he was away playing for Gloucestershire and who knows who else. And they tolerated this, the poor law union, because they were sort of, I mean, it's quite something to have W.G. Grace on, as one of your doctors.
Yes.
There were one or two who didn't like it at all. And then in the end, in 1898, he packs it in. And why does he pack it in? Because he's got this offer from the Crystal Palace Company to run this cricket club basically found this cricket club first of all and then run it in South London. And they're paying him a reasonable amount of money, more than he could earn as a doctor. And I think that the reason he took it was because it gave him more freedom to do the things that he liked to do. So it's a sort of mixed picture, really.
It is one of the things I love, one of the many things I love about the Golden Age. Well, really any cricket before, say, the advent of full-time professionalism is how you've got the greatest cricketer of his age who's also a doctor. I mean, that just doesn't happen in the modern world. And it's just brilliant hearing you talk about how he managed both of them.
And it's it's an extraordinary parallel life because you, again, from local newspapers, I came across one extraordinary story. It's a terrible story on one level because he was required to test. This just shows how he's both a very ordinary doctor and also he's just the most famous, arguably the most famous celebrity in the world. And there's this dreadful domestic violence case where it's a wife battering case, and he is required to testify in the local court about the injuries on this poor woman, and he dutifully goes and does his thing, and he's leaving the courthouse, and the clerk runs after him and says the judge, who's quite a senior judge, would on that regional circuit, the judge would like to see you in his chambers. And Grace thinks, okay, and he can't say no, so he goes back and he goes to the judge's chambers, thinking, what on earth have I done wrong? I'm sure. And the judge gets out a big book, his autograph book, and he wants W.G. Grace's autograph, which W.G. Grace signs, so the judge can go home and tell his wife, guess what I did today? I got W.G. Grace's autograph. So it is this incredible sort of double life that he's living.
I was thinking earlier, I'm sure there were patients of his who probably feigned injury or illness just to go and attend seeing famous Dr. W.G. Grace, I'm sure.
There's another thing you've reminded me of, which is one of the things he did in the winter was he was a football referee. soccer referee in
Yeah,
local
right.
games. And these games used to get. There was one game, and of course he gets into terrible rows with everybody, including one of the visiting clubs, and they think he's biased, and there's a huge great bust up. But the thing that's more interesting is these games they're just soccer games are in and around Bristol, and you get these huge crowds turning up. Several thousand
Mm.
people turn up because they want to see W.G. Grace refereeing, just seeing this guy. So he just attracts crowds wherever he goes.
I know, you know, doctor, exactly what is best for me. Hear me cry. Surely, doctor, you won't let me die. For if some love will make me gain, do your duty, doctor, cure my pain.
Well, returning to the cricket, and if we skip along to 1899,
Yeah,
we've mentioned this already, what turns out to be his final test match against the visiting Australian side of 1899 under Joe Darling. So he plays in the first test match of that series at Nottingham.
yeah,
It's iconic for a number of reasons now when we look back through the
hmm
lens of history. I mean, it's Wilfred Rhodes' first test match,
yeah,
and if I just love that team photo where you've got Grace, the aging Grace, sitting in the middle, and below him is the young Wilfred Rhodes, and
it's
between
fantastic.
them, I mean,
Yeah,
if you look at their first class career, the arc literally
yeah,
spans 8 decades. It's
yeah,
extraordinary.
it's amazing.
Um, and I think Victor Trumper makes his test debut for the touring Australians as well.
Mm,
In his first innings, Grace actually did okay. He as captain, he opened the batting with Fry and he scored 28 before being caught behind off Monty Noble. Fry went on to score a half century. In the second innings, he was out for one. He was bowled by Bill Howe, who I just happened to know doing some research the other day. Bill Howe was in a particular purple patch himself. He'd in a match just before this one against Surrey, he took all 10 wickets. So
right.
he was in fine form, but yeah, back to Grace,
hmm
out for one, clean bowled in the second innings. What do we make of his final test match, Richard? Did he play too long, do you think?
Well, definitely. And he knew that. I mean, that's why he threw in the towel afterwards. I think, as I was talking earlier about the death of Bessie, I think everything has to be seen in that context. That he sort of got completely dazed by grief, if you like, and he had already got it mired in a running dispute, which ended badly for him with Gloucestershire,
Mm.
about this weird idea he had that he was going to carry on playing for Gloucestershire while he was playing for this other club in London, southeast London, that he just started playing for. So that was going on. He clearly should not have been playing in the test match. There was already a lot of commentary in the press about the fact that he wasn't worth his place in the side. But the problem was that nobody could figure out a way of making W.G. Grace make the decision he needed to make as one of the senior selectors and indeed the captain of the team, that he was going to withdraw. And so he turns up for this test match, and he almost everything about it is humiliating for him. He opens the batting with C.B. Fry, who, as near as damn it, is basically what Grace had been back in the 1860s. And Fry is this magnificent athlete, champion athlete in his own right, plays football, plays all sorts of sports, brilliant batsman, fast between the wickets. Grace very obviously cannot keep up with Fry, and so they're missing all sorts of runs. I mean, Fry talks about this later, that they can't, there are sort of twos that they don't take, they turn into ones that they don't take because Grace just can't manage it. So that's where the humiliation begins, and he is then jeered by the crowd, the Nottinghamshire crowd, whenever he tries to field the ball or not field the ball, stooping down, mock cheering. So it's terrible from that point of view. And he does indeed finally, after this test match, realise that he just cannot go through this again, and he rules himself out. I mean, he basically at the next selectors meeting in London, he just says, "That's it, finish. I'm not going to play Test cricket again," which of course really is a decision he should have made quite some time before, because
Mm.
we can look at the statistics, but he played one absolutely great Test innings, which was his first ever Test, when he scores 152 and is, of course, famously pipped by Billy Murdoch, who
Mm.
scores 153. But he never again, he scores one other century, which seems to have been a rather sort of streaky century, and he never again really sort of hits the heights in Test cricket. So he's years beyond where he has any right to be in the Test team.
So let's talk about this move away from the Gloucestershire County Cricket Club, which happens around this time, in fact, in the same year as his final Test match. So he's the famous son of that cricket club, and he makes the switch to the newly formed London County Cricket Club, which is owned by the Crystal Palace Company. Why, essentially, in a nutshell, did he leave Gloucestershire, and what was it about this Crystal Palace Company that seemed so attractive to him?
Well, one of the things is it's a really weird story on one level, because he doesn't formally leave Gloucestershire. That's one of the the sort of nightmares that he leaves behind. But he does accept this contract to start this cricket club called London County Cricket Club, playing down in Crystal Palace Park, just beneath where the Crystal Palace had been, at the top of the hill, had been transplanted after the Great Exhibition. And they offer him a fairly attractive contract in terms of, basically it's an all year round contract, so he doesn't have to do his doctoring anymore. Um, and I think possibly he's looking for a sort of fresh start, but I don't. But in his own mind, he seems to think that he can carry on playing for Gloucestershire as well, which is completely contradictory, because the idea about London County, as the name
Mm.
implies, is it's a slither between Surrey and Kent that has, under local government, we're not going to get into this in detail, but it's local government real remapping basically means there's this area that they can call London County because it is in fact a county, and then it's going to be a first class county because it's got WG Grace. So that's the idea. He's going to earn some money, and the reason the Crystal Palace Company want him is because they're looking for an attraction. They're looking for somebody who can draw people down to Crystal Palace, down to Sydenham, and then go and look at all the other things in this enormous glass palace, which they've never really been able, in modern language, to monetize properly. I mean, it's a big loss making enterprise.
Mm.
So for them, it's sort of like the last throw of the dice. So it has everything going against it, in other words, as an enterprise.
Yeah, and last throw of the dice indeed. I mean, the London County Cricket Club folds in 1904, so it's only around for 5 or 6 summers. But that's not the end of WG's first class career. He keeps playing matches here and there, such as the famous gentlemen versus players matches. And then, even when he retires from first class cricket in 1908, he then just keeps playing minor cricket matches here and
Yeah,
there, way up until 1914.
yeah.
He's 66 when he plays his final
Yeah.
official match. What was it? I know this might be an impossible question to answer, or perhaps you've already answered it, but what was it about cricket that he loved so much and that he just couldn't give up?
Well, I think I was rereading what I'd written about this period, because, as I said, before I got to it, I thought, well, how on earth am I going to make this interesting? He's just playing this minor club cricket, lots of it, and it sort of seems slightly weird on one level, and in fact, I found it in the end terribly moving, and so I'll try and explain as briefly as I can why I did. And I accept this was the most subjective part of my book, really. And first of all, London County actually, initially, it's not a complete flop. I mean, it's quite jazzy cricket, because Grace is good at getting he's got Billy Murdoch is now living down the road from him, and he's a stalwart of this club, and he manages to get sort of teams to come and play against them, with the likes of CB Fry, Ranjit Singh, I think, plays there. So it's sort of quite jazzy. It sort of reminds me slightly. Do you remember the? Well, I'm old enough to remember the International Cavaliers. If you, it was sort
No,
of.
I don't. I don't. I'm
Well, this
afraid.
was back in the '60s, and it was kind
Right.
of like you'd find Dennis Compton turning out for them, and sort of, you know, basically sort of slightly superannuated, but great
Right.
cricketers would mix with the likes of Sobers. And anyway,
Mm.
it was a bit like that. The cricket club doesn't actually fold completely. And this is where I started getting really interesting, because it carries on. And this is a lot of the work, the initial work on sort of digging all of this stuff up. It was done by Joe Webber in that great book, the Chronicle of WG. And it sort of turns into just another cricket club in Surrey, Kent, that part of England. And you can find these games. I've even played. I come from that part of England where I used to play a lot of cricket down there, against clubs like Isha, Sutton, Cheam,
Mm.
you know, uh, uh, and these, the old style cricket books. And there you have Joe so and so bowled 24 by W.G. Grace
Mm.
and it's amazing. You can tell these ordinary club cricketers have a story to tell.
Yes.
So I'm then, and it then slides down a bit further, because he leaves Crystal Palace basically because they stopped paying him, and he has been a sort of meter and greeter for the football club. I mean, they decide that football is the thing, so that's when Crystal Palace Football Club is founded. For a while he does a bit for them, but then he moves to another part of, further east, another suburb called Mottingham, which is near Eltham. It's kind of semi-rural really back then, and he gets involved in the local cricket club. And he eventually, and this is a lower level of cricket, and he eventually ends up playing as captain of the second 11 of Eltham Cricket Club. I mean, can you imagine?
Yes.
You're just
Mm.
any old Joe Bloggs, and you turn up, and there's W.G. Grace playing against you.
Mm.
It's just the most amazing thing. So, what did I think about all of this? And I possibly over theorized, but I think that what comes out of this for me was the fact that Grace really did he just loved cricket. He was a true Corinthian in that sense. And I think it was also the only place where he had this, he was looking after his wife, who was in mourning for two of her children. He also had two other of his old ladies he was looking after at home, who one was, I think, a maiden aunt, and the other was a cousin. So that he's got this household, which is sort of, if you like, it's a very, very sort of, it's sad setting at home. Um, and he just loves cricket. And he goes on playing cricket until the outbreak of the First World War. And for me, there was one story which just summed it up. That this was another dimension of Grace that I hadn't really sort of considered enough, or it only came to the fore, if you like, at the very end of his life. And there's this incredibly pompous event that the MCC organises in 1912, which is the centenary of moving to the present ground at Lords. And we haven't really talked about this, but W.G. Grace had a far more semi-detached relationship with the MCC than the
Mm.
MCC's official history might make you believe. But anyway,
Yes.
they've got to have old W.G. Grace along for this sort of really silly game that's been organised against, I think it's the South African tourists, to commemorate this extraordinary event. And then there's this huge dinner afterwards, and Grace turns up at this dinner. He attends one day's play, and then he turns up at the dinner, and he's got this huge sticking plaster over his eye. And somebody said, "Well, what's happened, WG?" And it turns out he's injured it fielding in a game for Elton Seconds against something like Goldsmith College. And then they say, "Well, are you going to come along tomorrow to the game? Because there's another day." And he says, "I'm terribly sorry, but I've got another game of cricket I'm going off to." And that's him. He's
Yeah.
just wants to go on playing cricket. So for me, I accept that it was pretty subjective, but I felt that he becomes so endearing at the end of his life, playing and making all sorts of sort of feeble excuses for why he's got to go on playing cricket, to bring on the Colts and
Yeah.
all the rest of it.
It's really interesting hearing you talk about just his desire to play cricket. There's so many other examples of other cricketers from this same period. I had Gideon Haigh on the podcast talking about Warwick Armstrong, and he was the
Yeah,
same. I mean, just any match, regardless of
yeah,
rank or
yeah.
importance, he would be up for it, even if it was up against children. I mean, he would just be
And did
wanted to be
Armstrong
part
do
of the
the
match.
same thing as go on play, after he'd ceased playing first class cricket? Did he?
I don't think so. Not certainly to the extent of Grace. I mean,
Yeah,
Armstrong had quite a long career. I mean,
right.
he led Australia to England in 1921 to great success, and
Yeah,
not too dissimilar to Grace. At that point he was huge. He was, known as the big ship, and he'd become
right.
this iconic large figure like Grace. I don't think he
Yeah,
kept playing sort of infinitely like Grace, but
yeah, yeah,
just loved playing any match. If a match was put to him, he would accept. It's just, yeah,
yeah,
these men just can't get enough of the game, which is, it's
yeah,
endearing, I think.
yeah.